Welcome to the Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast, hosted by David Mandell, an attorney, author, and OJM Group partner. We share real-world financial lessons from physicians and insights from experts to impact your bottom line. Check the show notes to get a free copy of our book, Wealth Strategies for Today's Physician. Now, over to David.
Hello, this is David Mandell, host of the program. Thanks for joining us, whether you're on YouTube and you can see mine and Teri's smiling faces, or most of you, I'm sure, just listening on the podcast networks and platforms. I've got a great guest today. We're going to learn a lot. Let me tell you about Teri Yates, and then we'll start in. So Teri is the founder and CEO of Accountable Physician Advisors, a consulting firm that helps doctors be successful at the business of medicine while maintaining their independence. Teri describes herself as a private practice evangelist, and I love that. And since she started her journey in 2013 as a one-woman consulting firm, Teri has launched 2 additional companies focused on serving the needs of private practice physicians. Collectively, Teri's companies provide services to more than 90 aspiring private practice physicians and established medical practices over the last 12 years. Her companies employ more than 45 people with diverse experience and expertise in business development, healthcare operations, healthcare finance, and revenue cycle management. In her personal consulting practice, Teri focuses on business strategy, physician leadership development, and practice governance. She's a frequent guest on podcasts like this one, and a speaker. And I met her at a medical conference where we were both attending and presenting. And before launching the Accountable family of companies, she worked for 17 years in executive leadership positions with hospital-based and outpatient radiology practices. So with that, Teri, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great. It's great. I know we talked about doing this, and now we finally got it done. So that's great.
Absolutely.
All right. So, obviously, we're going to put a link to the full bio. I cut that down just for time period. We'll put that in the show notes. But maybe you can flesh it out a little bit. Like, how long have you been in the field? What sparked you to, branch out and form your own firm, Accountable Physician Advisors? Give us a little bit of that story.
Sure. So I've worked in healthcare my whole career. It's all I've ever done. And in just different types of settings. And when I was early in my career, I actually thought I wanted to be a nurse when I would grow up. And so I went to nursing school for a couple of years, and then I decided to change majors into healthcare administration because I thought I didn't want to be bossed around by doctors every day. And as it turned out, then I spent the rest of my career in service of doctors, and that's what I'm really passionate about and love to do. And so, as you said in my bio, I've worked in a lot of different areas, but I've never worked for a hospital. In all of my career, I've always been in the outpatient settings. And, the last job I had before I started my consulting firm is I was the chief of quality and risk and compliance for a group of 150 physicians. When I got into consulting, it was because that large physician practice, which was private equity backed, was not generating the returns for their investors that they were hoping for. And so, a third of the non-physician workforce got laid off. And I was one of those individuals. And I thought, well, I'm pretty type A and I'll do a little consulting on the side while I'm looking for a real job. But I quickly realized that there was such an exciting opportunity. And it was so fun doing the work that I'm doing now. And so I figured out this is my real job, and I've never looked back.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I like that term, real job. That's a good one. But it's quite an entrepreneurial story you have too. You could see it in the bio and how many people work for and with you on your teams, and that you started just as a solo person. So
yeah, this was a side hustle in my spare bedroom, and a lot of people worry, I think, about leaving the security of the corporate world. But the truth of the matter is, it's been a long journey. But after about 2 or 3 years, I came to understand that it was a good bet to bet on myself and that I've had more job security and comfort than I ever felt working for someone else, because I can make all the decisions, and I can, make the decisions I know are going to be best for my clients, which is where I think, long-term success comes from. That's why I called my company Accountable, is because we're accountable to our clients. And if you do the right thing, I believe that good things happen for you.
And, I'm sure that translates in how you talk to physicians, especially those who may be thinking about branching out and starting their own practice, who've been in a large group and, that's not working for them and they want to do their own thing. And you can tell them from experience that, it's not always easy. It's not always fun to be the boss, but it can be done and can be done successfully and reward in a way that's rewarding. So that brings me to my first real question, which is, let's start with, because you work with practices in a lot of different stages, let's say. So let's talk about, and I didn't plan this being a segue, but it sort of is that new private practice, whether it's a doc just coming out of training, or as we were just talking about, leaving sort of corporate practice or large group and then having the confidence to come out and start a practice. What are the key checklist items? What are the priority must-haves or must-avoids that you're talking to those kinds of docs about?
Sure. And, we start between 3 to 5 new medical practices every year. That's part of our business. It's not all of our business, but there are, a lot goes into it. Our typical client who does this is usually someone who's been out for a little bit. They're maybe in their early 40s and they took a job either as a hospital employee or maybe employed by another group. And at some point, they've gotten the itch to have more control. That's usually what it's about, is autonomy. And so when you start a new medical practice, there are several dozen steps and tasks that have to be done. But the most crucial place to start is a financial feasibility study. First of all, determine if you should do this. Is it wise to do this? And then you've got to figure out, how am I going to finance this? Do I have my own money that I've saved? Am I going to need to borrow? What should that look like? And how much to borrow, which is one of the things you learn when you conduct a feasibility study.
Yeah.
Another place that everybody thinks about is office space. And, should I rent office space or should I own it? Because owning real estate is a very, can be, if it's done correctly, a very good investment for a physician. And then the other thing people worry about is payer credentialing and contracting. Can I get in the networks? And so those are, I would say, some of the highest priority items that are at the start of the project.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm shaking my head the whole time here, but especially on the feasibility study, I think in certain areas, geographic, et cetera, it may be pretty clear there's so much demand for this that, people think I can skip that step. But I think that would probably be unwise regardless, even if you're not in a saturated market, even if it's a growing city or something, to have that kind of study. So it gives you some discipline around not just, and you can tell me if this is right, is it financially feasible, but, some order of magnitude of what we can expect in year 1 and 2 and 3 and some growth rate, so we can have the confidence or the conservative approach regarding things like office space and what have you. Meaning, in my mind, if I'm in a place where the demand is just incredible and I'm coming out and we see that in the feasibility study, well, I might be more confident to buy a place. Mm-hmm. Versus, you can make this work. You're going to have to get, but it might be a step back before a step forward. It's probably better to rent to at least maybe do a short-term lease and see if, we have our feet underneath each other on the practice before we go into a purchase. Do those things kind of interact to some degree, the feasibility and the investment in the property or equipment or other things like that?
They do. Every project is unique, and there are some people that to your point, they're in a really high demand area and they're doing quite an expansive project. I am probably by nature more conservative in part because I am a founder and I bootstrap my business. I never borrowed any money for my own company until 2020 when the pandemic happened. Everything else was self-funded. And so I tend to be conservative. And I always tell doctors, a very conservative way to go about starting a new practice is phase 1, phase 2. Don't build your dream house for your first phase. Find a place that's relatively inexpensive, smaller, that you can lease, but not for 10 years, right? For a shorter time interval. Get some cash flow going. Assess how much the demand really is out there for your services, and then build your dream house. And, look, not everybody does it that way, and not everybody has to do it that way. But that's a very, to me, highly correlated with the physician's satisfaction with the startup is when they don't overspend on real estate. But it also removes that temptation in some respect to sign a 10-year lease if you're not saying, this is it, I'm going to stay here forever, because a landlord will give you a big package to build out a lovely large space if you want that, but then they're going to want a 10-year lease. And so if you're going in for a short-term lease, then, it keeps your options open to then develop your own real estate, which is, again, financially quite lucrative.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally makes sense. Kind of take it in stages, as any business, really would be doing. Okay, so that's just a couple of thoughts and sort of high level insights on the new practice. Now, you certainly, I know this, work with a large number of established practices. So, give us some things there that are kind of like red flags, or where you've seen practices not do well, because I think that's just as much important in this podcast as what we want to do well.
Yeah. Well, when it gets to the reasons that a private practice might fail financially, the first thing I have to say, and, I'm humble about this and I understand that could change, and at some point it will, given the number of businesses we've been involved in starting. But so far to date, none of the new medical practices that we've launched have failed financially. And that is in part because we are very, diligent about the feasibility study, and a large percentage of the feasibility studies we do, the doctor decides afterward, I'm not moving forward with the project, because they didn't really understand what it was going to take financially to do it. So the people that move forward are committed because they're well informed. But
I want to come back to that. It's like, I know you got a couple other points, but that's really, really interesting to me. But let's come back to that. Okay.
Sure. So, the things that cause private practices to struggle financially, because we come in and do assessments, right? People will call us in and we do an assessment to see what's going on in the business because they want to make it better financially. And the common reasons that we see practices struggle are, one, the due diligence was not done in advance. And so oftentimes they're undercapitalized at startup. Without that budget and pro forma, they don't borrow enough money, and then it gets very uncomfortable because there is quite a lag as you're building your revenue stream and you're building your accounts receivable. And so that can be really challenging, and particularly in instances where you've overbuilt on the office, you have a lot of high fixed costs if you have high cost expensive equipment. So one is undercapitalizing from the start can make it really tough. The second is almost the opposite problem, where doctors don't spend enough on the right things. And so if you don't have qualified management personnel to help running the practice, that's another predictor of problems, because physicians mostly do not get any training. They don't get any business training in medical school. And yet, if you're a private practice owner, you are a small business owner. And so you need to have a qualified administrator, or at least consultant, or somebody advising you as a physician as you're learning the business of administration and running a business. And then another big factor that predicts problems are owners that don't commit enough time to running the business. Businesses don't run themselves. And so you've got to have enough time in your week to practice medicine, but you got to carve out a few hours a week to manage the finances and manage people and do all of that administrative stuff as the owner. Now, on the success side, factors that predict success are, one, you got to be a good doctor. If you're not a good doctor, you're probably not going to have a successful practice. But assuming that you're going to, be a good doctor, we've talked about not spending too much at the front end. But the other thing is when you're just trying to run any business, you've got to have a relentless focus on data and analyzing what's happening in your business and holding people accountable. And I think if you focus on the data and you hold people accountable, you're likely to be successful.
Yeah, just so many, got a whole episode just on what you talked about in 3 minutes here, but I want to come back first to that failing the feasibility study, because I think a lot of people, when they hear that, said, oh, the feasibility study, that's like, the first step but it's always going to be like a go forward. It's always going to be a green light, and that's not really tied to the word feasibility, because some things are feasible and some things are not, right? So and I think it's a credit to your firm too, because obviously there's business to be done when a client, a doctor says, I want to move forward, right? So, but you're giving them the honest assessment with, the analysis that you guys do, I'm guessing, and sometimes it comes up a red light or a very significant yellow, like, hey, warning sign. This, it's not we're not saying you can't do it or you shouldn't, but you got to go. This is not like a no-brainer. So you have, let me just ask the question I'm getting to, which is, you have docs coming to you saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing a private practice. You're going through this feasibility study, and at the end of that, they're saying, based on this analysis, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay as an employed doc or look at another practice or do something different than launch a new practice. Is that right? And
more than 50% of the projects that we do a feasibility study for do not go forward. It used to be probably 30% did not go forward, but as reimbursements have ratcheted down tighter, probably it's more 50-50. And sometimes that looks like it's not going to be profitable. Sometimes it just looks like it's not substantially more profitable than what I'm doing now.
Right.
Sometimes it looks like I don't like how much capital I'm going to have to put up initially. There's a lot of different flavors of that. And sometimes here's an example. We got hired to do a feasibility study for someone, and they were thinking about building an ambulatory surgery center, which is a wonderful asset for a physician in a lot of ways, but it's a big, heavy lift financially.
Sure.
When we really went through all of the numbers, the doctor had to weigh the risks and benefits, and it looked profitable, but that doctor also had an opportunity to invest in somebody else's existing ASC, and it wasn't so wildly profitable that felt like it was worth it compared to the lower risk investment opportunity they had. And that's okay.
Right.
That's okay. Our fees to do a feasibility study are probably a tenth of what our consulting fees would be to start a new practice. So you're right. We've got every incentive in the world to say do it, because then we stand to potentially earn a lot more money. But our success over this last 12 years has been based on physicians telling their friends that accountable is trustworthy.
Right.
And, so for us, we would never be successful if we were earning money by hurting people.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. And what that tells me also is, because I know this, that there are a lot of docs who are not doing that, who are skipping that step, who are just saying, hey, I want to be my own boss and go out and do the practice, et cetera. And that tells me that that kind of explains why so many practices are getting into trouble financially. Because if 50% of the people who are coming to you are doing it the right way, and you're saying, well, it could be done, but it maybe not be, like you said, for all the reasons. Maybe you have an opportunity to invest as a passive rather than do it yourself. Maybe you have it's better, but it's not that much better than what you're making already as a W-2, et cetera. And so it's not worth all the headache and all that. What that tells me is if you don't do this, you might have a 50-50 shot of getting yourself in trouble, because, this isn't like, not even my brother, but my father's day, where basically everybody who started practice made money, right? I mean, you couldn't, that's 50 years ago now, right? 60 years ago. So the other thing I want to point out is that sliding scale that you mentioned between being undercapitalized. These are now we're getting to, you've moved forward, and why doesn't it work well? Undercapitalization to spending too much on the wrong stuff, right? So it's not just a simple throw money at it answer, because you could spend money on the wrong things, but it's also not a do it as cheap as possible answer. It really is. It takes more savvy, more wisdom, more experience, more expertise to figure out where you're going to be in that sliding scale, and try to be on the efficient frontier, as they say in the investment.
Yeah, you got to spend money on the right things. I mean, I had a client that we did consulting for in his startup, but he was very fixated on what billing services were going to cost. And he hired someone for billing, and I knew this was going to be a problem, but he got a very low percentage from them. And I talked to the guy about 6 months after he opened. He was a very busy interventional cardiologist, and he was sitting on his own on Friday afternoons calling insurance companies and haggling with them himself about claims that weren't paid. And I was like, you could be generating so much more revenue doing 2 more cases than you would be paying a better billing partner.
Yeah, of course. Highest and best use we've talked about. That's been a huge theme for 6 years on this podcast. Delegation, surrounding yourself with experts. I mean, it's just like, I could give examples, right? People who want to do their own tax returns, people who want to, go on LegalZoom and do that rather than hiring a lawyer, all that kind of stuff. So, okay, I want to keep moving because you got a couple other real important topics. So in a practice, that's ongoing, and a lot of docs listening to this are in practices that are, ongoing. They're not a startup, but they're not looking to jump. They're in their own practice. How important is revenue cycle management? And I guess we were kind of talking about that right then. And where does that fit into a successful practice?
Well, I mean, it's fundamental. So, cash is king, right? If you don't have any margin, you don't have any mission. There's you can say it in a bunch of different ways. But one of the things I learned when I started the consulting business, because at first I was doing a lot of assessment and, management consulting for improvements, and everybody had problems with billing. It was just a nuisance, whether you hired an outside company, whether your own people did it yourself. And look, that's what started me down the path of starting a billing company, which I did, after I was out consulting for about 3 years. I mean, I hate insurance companies. If you'd asked me, 10 years ago, do you ever want to have a billing company? I would have said, no way. But it was a problem for everyone. And so, it's fundamental to the success of the practice. It's very poorly done, and it's very poorly understood. And so, most doctors think about billing as being something that's handled by the people that work in one department or an outsourced vendor. But revenue cycle management is actually kind of a process. It's a relay, if you will, that requires active participation from a lot of people, whether they're in your practice, in the clinic setting, at the hospital, in the billing department. It's all over the place. And so, there's more than a dozen steps in the revenue cycle that have to be executed properly for you to get all the money. And it's challenging because I don't think a lot of physicians understand all of that, and they don't necessarily know how to change it if one of those steps is not working the way it should. And it's really hard to understand it because the reports that doctors get, the billing reports, aren't very instructive. For the most part, it's usually, this is how much you charged, these are the write-offs we took, this is how much you got paid. Maybe you get a list of individual procedures or services that you rendered, but most of the billing reports aren't that useful in terms of understanding, why did I get paid that much this month? So, we kind of think that the easiest way to teach anybody, whether it's a doctor, administrator, or anyone, about the revenue cycle is to put data into visualizations, the USA Today, the charts and the graphs. And we use advanced tools that are business intelligence tools. So in our practice, it's Power BI, where it's interactive. And so, when I look at those payments for the month, I can click into those, and then the next layer is who all the insurance companies are. Or if I'm in my accounts receivable aging page and I look at, all of the money that's sitting in my AR that's more than 6 months old, and I don't, like the fact I haven't been paid, I can just click and see, well, who are the individual insurance companies? And then I can click and drill deeper and see what are the reasons for these denials. And so that kind of interactive data visualization is what I think takes RCM out of the shrouded kind of mystery for physicians, and helps them learn more about it so that people can make things better.
Yeah. It's not an area I know a lot about, but I do agree with you that it seems to be something that almost every physician or practice complains about, or feels like, even if they feel like they're doing a decent job, they know there's money left on the table. Like, I don't think there's anybody that I've ever heard when they talk about this subject is like, oh yeah, we got that totally wired. Like that, we don't have any issues with that. And I think that's probably just the nature of the process. But going beyond sort of the first layer, it sounds like is crucial. You got to get a little more. It gets back to what you said before, which is you got to understand, if you can't, right? There's that old saying, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it, right? So, and measure might be more than just that first layer. It might be understanding that second layer of what's happening below the surface. So that part I can certainly follow you on. So let's talk about operational efficiency beyond revenue cycle. What about, things related to staff?
Yeah.
That's, again, I would say probably, and this isn't just with medicine, but staffing and people issues are probably the biggest challenge for most businesses, to be honest with you. I mean, and it's certainly universal for anything from our business to, law firms I've been part of, et cetera. Every business sort of, especially in service area, comes to people, and that when it comes to people, it's not always so easy. So how do you guys help physicians, and what do you see there as best practices?
Yeah. Well, staffing is definitely the pain point, especially over the last couple of years. And look, we're facing healthcare worker shortages that are going to get worse, before they get better. And so this is an area I'm particularly passionate about because I do a lot of work around some of these things in my own consulting firm or my consulting practice. And so there's one way that we help people is very tactical, right? I have a lot of open positions that need to be filled, and I don't have enough bandwidth to get it done. And so, we have an HR division that will help physicians just go recruit and hire people. That's fine, and that's necessary. We do a lot of that. But what I'm really interested in is how to create the type of business that employees want to work for and they want to stay working for, and more importantly, that they're the kind of employees that you want to have working for you. Because I see a lot of physicians who feel so behind the 8 ball on staffing that they have low performers and they're afraid to fire them because they just don't have enough bodies, period. And so that's a race to the bottom. And so I do a lot of work with physicians and coaching them on how to create the operating philosophy for their business that's going to encourage excellence, and how to, again, they're not intuitively good managers sometimes of people, how to manage in a way that gets the most out of your employees, and how to get important employees to work effectively with each other as a team, because you can have a lot of individual stars, but if they don't play nicely with each other, you don't get the kind of traction in your business that you need to. And so that's really important. And that's the science of management that we like to help people with.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's, we've had different people on this podcast over the years talk about this challenge. And I do like the fact that you folks, help both on the immediate, hey, we got to hire somebody, but also the bigger picture, which is, let's get the right people in the right seats and do that. And, again, for a lot of physicians and even for, folks in my business, not everyone is a good manager, or not everybody, is really they could maybe improve on the margins, but it's just not their nature. And frankly, they might need somebody to be the right hand to handle a lot of that while they go see patients and do some of the business decisions, and they can do the best they can as a HR type of person, but they're going to need help to figure that.
In prompting, not just delegation. Delegation is important, but also that person who sits next to them that whispers into the doctor's ear, remember to say these things to the employees, because here's the truth. The buck stops with me and my company. And if you're a physician who owns a practice, the buck stops with you. And the last thing I did right before I stepped in to record this podcast with you was something we do in my company. We had 2 new employees who were starting their first day of work today, and the HR manager orders lunch for them. And I sat in on the lunch and we had lunch together. And, it was very organic. I didn't, there's not a big PowerPoint presentation, but I chatted with these 2 people and found out a little bit about them and where they came from. And then I used that time to tell them a little bit about our work philosophy, and that it's very important to me that the people who work here really enjoy their day, because work is hard enough without making it harder. And what that really boils down to is, in our company, we figured out that if we have mean girls or mean guys, everybody feels worse and productivity declines. And so that's important. I don't have a lot of time to do that. And I have other people who manage, both of those employees every day. But me taking the time as the owner to say to them, this is what I expect, is very powerful.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad we recorded the podcast today, because then you have that story fresh. We didn't know that was going to happen, but I think that's probably the kind of thing that many physicians who are partners in a practice should be doing and aren't. Right? They're saying, I push that off to someone else. I say hi in the hallway, and I might just shake their hand when they first show up first day, but I'm not spending that extra time to get to know them, but also to really have it come down from the head person what the philosophy and what the approach is here. This is how we do things here. And you want to hear it from the person whose name is on the, on the door type thing.
Right. Exactly. Now, when if that employee does something that does not fit with the philosophy, it's not the physician's job to go do the discipline. Your practice administrator does that. However, you have made it clear what the expectations are, and now empowered the practice administrator to hold that individual accountable to your philosophy for how your business should be run.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really good example and real world. So, and for my last question, I want to change this. We've been talking really micro practice level, right? Now let's go macro. What's going on in the world, in the world of healthcare? So obviously, we all know this, more and more physician employment. And we've seen this in our careers working with docs. And, in the beginning of OJM and when I was an attorney, most were private practice physicians. And now, I don't know the exact percentage in our world, but there's a lot more employed docs. And that seems to be what's been going on all across the country. So, you've built your business around private practice. And we love private practice because we can do some things, help them with their qualified plan, help them with their corporate structure, their taxation, et cetera, that we can't do for employed docs. We love our employed docs too, but it's just a different level of work we can help them with. So what's your outlook on the future of private practice? Where do you see things today and that we start in 2026 and in the near future?
Well, there are a lot of people opining that private practice is dying, right? And I don't believe that. Obviously, I don't believe that because this is what I've chosen to do for my life's work for more than a decade. We get more than a dozen inquiries every year for people, thinking about starting a new private practice. So people still want to go into private practice. And, usually the driver, like I said, is autonomy. It's not about money. Money matters. People have to, it has to be a good financial decision. But generally, what drives people to private practice is the desire to control their environment, to choose who their employees are, all of those things. I think it's actually vital to the health of our healthcare system for us to have a thriving, community of physicians in independent practice, because frankly, outpatient settings are more efficient. When physicians work in the hospital, everything happens more slowly and less efficiently. And that's a problem because demographic trends are showing that we are going to have increasingly severe shortages of physicians. It's more, it's going to be worse in certain specialties, but this is an issue. The population is aging. There are not enough physicians coming out of training to keep up with what's needed. And so we got a big lift using physician extenders. That was one thing that really expanded, physician capacity. But we've got to do things more efficiently. And so I work with a lot of surgeons, and if, they're doing their cases in an office space, surgery suite, or an ambulatory surgery center, it literally often means I can do 6 operations today instead of 4.
Right.
And that's what the healthcare system needs, both from a cost perspective, but also just so that we have enough physicians to care for everybody who needs it. And, obviously, if you have good ancillaries, which is a crucial part of physician income in private practice,
Right.
you can make a lot more money, statistically speaking, than you do when you're employed. So I'm actually quite optimistic that private practice is going to continue to be a very important part of our healthcare system.
I think as long as the interest is there being autonomous, which is, I think, most physicians just by their nature
Right.
are autonomous. And certainly they go to med school and most training, and that encourages that, right? Everybody thinks they're on their own, and it's kind of an individualized profession. With what you also described as a higher demand, that means that physicians should have some power in that people need them. So if they want to be out in private practice, now again, that's fighting against consolidation, that's fighting against hospitals, that's fighting against maybe some of the economics, but I hope that you are right. I think so also. Listen, my brother's, a solo cardiologist, and there aren't many of those around, but he's
there are
for a long time. So, and why? He likes being his own boss, and I'm sure he knows in some ways that there's some things that he could be doing if he was with a group that he can't do personally, but at this point, that's been worth it for him. So hopefully there's more of that to come. Teri, I really appreciate you being on. Really I learned a bunch, and I'm sure the people listening and watching, we will, again, in the show notes, make sure we have Teri's website and a way to get a hold of her. So if you want to talk to her about your existing practice, your thoughts about a new practice and that feasibility study, which I think is so important, you'll have a way to do that. So thanks, Teri, for being on the program.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And for everybody watching and listening, again, in another 2 weeks, we'll have another episode. If you're a physician who has something interesting to say, feel free to reach out. Would love to have you on. And if you feel so inclined, give us a 5-star review, a rating on the exchanges and the platforms, and tell all your colleagues about us. And with that, we will conclude, and we'll see you in another 2 weeks.
The Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast is brought to you by OJM Group. a multidisciplinary wealth management firm dedicated to helping physicians build and preserve their wealth while reducing taxes. Episodes from previous seasons are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other popular platforms. Podcast listeners can get a free copy of our book, Wealth Strategies for Today's Physician. Simply text WPPOD to 844-418-1212 to request your free copy. Be sure to join David every 2 weeks for the newest episode of the Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast. This podcast is being provided for informational purposes only. The ideas and opinions expressed on this show by Mr. Mandell and his guests do not constitute legal tax or investment advice, or a recommendation of any particular security or strategy, and do not represent the opinions of the underwriters of this programming. Any information prepared from third-party sources is believed to be reliable, though its accuracy is not guaranteed. Opinions expressed in this commentary reflect subjective judgments of the speakers, based on conditions at the time of recording, and are subject to change without notice. Listeners should seek the input of their own financial, tax, and legal professionals before acting on any of the information provided.